Good evening, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and welcome to the 2021 Dallas Smythe Memorial Lecture. My name is Enda Brophy. I teach in the School of Communication and the Labor Studies program at SFU. I'm going to serve as the moderator for tonight's lecture. While this event takes place in the virtual space of Zoom, it is critical for us to acknowledge that SFU lies on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples of the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Coquitlam nations. I'm currently joining you from North Burnaby on the unceded territories of the Squamish and Halkomelem peoples. So tonight's lecture marks almost exactly 1 year since our university campuses have been mostly shut down due to COVID-19. Last year was the first time in the 28-year history of this lecture that we were forced to cancel the physical gathering and to move it online. And I will never forget that in the conversations leading up to it, last year's lecturer, Dr. Jack Shou, who was then based in Hong Kong, gave us a glimpse of our future on the West Coast when he said, after almost 2 months of lockdown over there, he said, "It's not that bad. You'll get used to it." So after having spent after a year spent mostly in lockdown and a lot of learning on Zoom, we've indeed gotten used to it, although I can safely say we're all looking forward to it ending and next year's event being in person. So I'm going to be introducing the 2021 Smythe Lecture, Dr. Ursula Huws, shortly. But before that, I'd like to spend a few minutes or so discussing this annual event, how it'll be run, and the scholar whose memory we're here to celebrate. We have opted for a regular Zoom meeting rather than a webinar format to try as much as possible to replicate the feel of being in a room together. But we do have a lot of attendees tonight, so we would ask that you please listen and follow our rules of engagement. We ask that you keep your microphones muted unless you're asking a question, please. The lecture will last around 45 minutes, after which there's going to be time for a Q&A session. I do have technical support, thankfully, but I'm also the sole moderator for this event. As a result, I'm going to ask you to please use the raise hand function to ask a question. And I'm going to explain how to do this later before the Q&A session. Once the Q&A session begins, I'm going to pick 3 people with raised hands, let you know the order you'll be asking questions in. Please remember to unmute yourself, keep your questions brief, and then mute yourself and lower your hand again so we can move on to the next question. Once the questions have been answered, I'm going to pick another 3 people to ask questions. We'll begin the process again. Please do try and ask your questions this way rather than via the chat, because otherwise it will be difficult for me to keep an eye on that. If needed, closed captioning is available at the bottom of your screen. Click on live transcript and show subtitles. I'll also remind you again that this lecture is being recorded and is going to be made available via the School of Communication's YouTube channel. Next, I need to say a few thank yous. I'd like to thank Alex Klinke, Brian Langdo, Emma Keeler-Dugas, and Chris Jaselnik for helping out with Zoom details, publicizing this event, post-production editing. I'd also like to thank the School of Communication, the Labor Studies program, and the Faculty of Communication, Art, and Technology for supporting this event. Each year, the Smythe Memorial Lecture honors a critical scholar whose work has made a mark on or has important implications for the political economy of communication. Dallas Smythe was a professor of communication at SFU from 1976 till he passed away in 1992. He's now recognized globally as a leading scholar of communication processes as well as a founding figure in the political economy of communication. Almost 3 decades from his passing, Smythe's work is more relevant than ever to the contemporary media landscape. Smythe's scholarship was deeply marked by his personal history and convictions. He was born in Canada, and he trained as an economist in the United States before returning after being blacklisted for belonging to pacifist and social justice organizations during the Cold War. Smythe's political convictions only intensified over the course of his life. And it's exactly those kinds of political convictions that we need more than ever in our current conjuncture. It's in this spirit that I would like to tell you about a campaign which has been launched today to end the outsourcing of cleaning and food services work at SFU. Outsourcing of these essential campus services has generated a low-wage, insecure, precarious workforce which could not be more different demographically than the university's highest paid employees. Cleaners and food service workers on our SFU campuses are primarily women, people of color, and immigrants. They've suffered layoffs and intensified precarity as a result of the pandemic. This morning, we delivered a letter signed by 80 faculty members to President Joy Johnson and VP Finance and Admin, Martin Pacherko, asking that SFU end its practice of outsourcing food and cleaning services and begin the process of planning to take the services back in-house. The letter summarizes our findings in a comparison of the collective agreements of contract workers at SFU and those of workers performing similar work in-house at UBC and UVic. And not surprisingly, SFU contract cleaners and food service workers fare worse in every single respect than their colleagues at those 2 universities. So please do sign our public letter, follow the campaign on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and join the campaign if you're able to help. Tonight, we're extremely lucky to have Dr. Ursula Huws delivering the Smythe Memorial Lecture. Dr. Huws is a leading figure globally in feminist political economy, the political economy of communication, and the analysis of digital labor. She's the author of numerous field-defining books, including The Making of a Cybertariat, Virtual Work in a Real World, Labor in Contemporary Capitalism, What's Next, and most recently, Reinventing the Welfare State, Digital Platforms and Public Policies. Dr. Huws is the founder and director of Analytica Social and Economic Research, an independent research company which has conducted groundbreaking studies on platform work in recent years. She is the founder of the interdisciplinary international peer-reviewed journal Work Organization, Labor and Globalization, and she's in demand for speaking events across the world, including some virtual events recently with audiences close to 1,000 people. So this is actually a small group this evening for Dr. Huws. Dr. Huws has also just recently retired from a distinguished academic career, and for this and many other reasons besides, deserves our congratulations. And finally, I would like to thank Dr. Huws for joining us at what is 3 a.m. her time. So this year's Smythe Lecture will actually make 2 in a row where the lecturer is joining us from the future, because in London, it's already Thursday, and so St. Patrick's Day is over, regrettably. So without further ado, I present Dr. Ursula Huws.
Well, thank you very, very much, Anda, for that very nice and flattering introduction, and many apologies for keeping you late. It was you can blame the time difference for this and the fact that the clocks haven't gone back in the UK the way they have in Canada. It's a huge honour to be with you tonight, as it is for me, for this, this is incredibly prestigious and internationally known lecture series. It's really, a terrific honour and privilege to be addressing you. and especially nice for me to be speaking to an audience where I can speak in English and don't, use what isn't actually my native tongue. My native tongue is Welsh, but use the language that I normally work in without worrying that most of you don't have it as a first language. So when Enda first asked me to do this lecture, I kind of said, well, what do most people say? What do you cover? And he said, well, people often use it as an excuse to sort of reprise a lifetime's work. But luckily, he said, you've got some very current and recent research that you can present. And that immediately, it's like that Mark Twain short story, where the little boy is told to stand in the corner of the room and not think of a white elephant. That immediately, of course, and perversely got me thinking about my early career. And when I started doing the kind of research that is the topic of today's lecture. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. So of course, I'm afraid you're going to have to indulge me. That's what I started thinking about. And what I realized is the extraordinary parallels between the research concerns that we had in the 1970s and the situation that we're in today. And it's almost like, well, it's not like a circle going round because, history doesn't quite work like that. And I hope my research isn't just going back, the wheel turning and going back to the beginning again. I hope it's kind of a spiral and that we learn a little bit each time we go around the cycle. But it does seem to me that there is a lot to be learned from history and that some of that experience is relevant. I'm going to just quickly take you through that before I go into my current research. I started off in the very early 70s. I entered the formal labour market in 1970, working in the publishing industry, and I was, which at that time was ununionised in the UK. I was an activist in the union, which was the same trade union as for newspaper journalists. And so one of the things I became aware of really, certainly in the mid-70s, very early days, was the development of what was then called new technology, which was the first sort of wave of computerized technology to hit labour in Europe. And one of the first groups of workers that were affected were newspaper workers. And we got very interested in, what the implications of this new technology was, and clubbed together and sent somebody across the United States to go and interview workers at the Washington Post, which was the first newspaper to move over to computerized technology in the United States, and talk to the print workers and talk to the journalists, and looked at the implications of all this, and produced a pamphlet called Journalists and the New Technology. And it became very, very clear that this computerized technology was absolutely revolutionizing print work, and was also in parallel developments. There were also major implications for auto workers with the introduction of the very, very first robots into auto factories in Italy at the time. So it was interested in this kind of abstract way in the impact of new technology, and then moved up to a new job in Yorkshire in the north of England, and I became aware that the technologies that were being used in the print were also being introduced into offices. It was suddenly realized it had much broader implications for much larger numbers of workers than just print workers. There were these brand new machines called word processors, were being starting to be introduced into offices, and there were all these people in doing data entry in the company I worked for. It did publishing, it did a lot of other things as well. And it was the biggest school book distributor in the UK. And so you had all these people in offices entering data into keyboards. And one day I was sort of in the ladies' loo and I saw these two women there rocking backwards and forwards with their heads like this. And I said, what's the matter? And I said, oh, we've got headaches. They had these terrible headaches. And it was because of the screens. And working intensively at screens as they were doing was just giving these terrible headaches. So I started doing research on this and discovered that there was some Swedish research about the hazards of working with video display terminal screens. And anyway, so I was kind of interested in technology at work. And then in 1976, the BBC broadcast a program called Now the Chips Are Down, which was about the silicon chip and how it was going to have these massive implications for labor. And suddenly all the newspapers were all washed with stories about how millions of jobs were going to disappear because of this new technology. And in the meanwhile, I'd been doing all these little bits of research for office workers about what the implications of VDT screens were. And we'd set up a trade union resource centre in Yorkshire, the city I was in, to give information to workers. And so suddenly overnight, I became like this expert on new technology in labour because nobody else had done that research. And thus began a whole sort of career really of doing research on technology and labour. And of course I was also a feminist and also very involved in debates about domestic labour and you know, in those days there were these huge serious discussions among Marxists and feminists about, you know, does domestic labour produce surplus value or not, and what kind of labour is domestic labour, and so on. And so these two things were going together in my head. But what was happening more generally among scholars on the left was the beginning of a series of discussions which are very much parallel the discussions having now about how many jobs are going to disappear because of new technology. What are the implications? Is this going to bring capitalism to its knees? You know, because robots don't buy cars. So if, you know, if all the factories are staffed by robots, but workers are out of work, there's going to be nobody there to buy the products. And a group called the Conference of Socialist Economists, which was a group of academics doing research on labour, doing kind of serious leftist research, set up a working group to talk about the impact of technology on labour, what we would now, I suppose, call the digitalisation on labour. And I was invited to this group, and they were putting together a book. And the whole sort of debate focused around, it was based on this assumption that all the jobs were going to disappear. And just as very many debates do now, you look at the debates about, you know, why we need a basic citizen's income and so on, it's all premised on this idea that there's going to be mass unemployment because of automation. And I just kept thinking, well, that doesn't seem how it works. And I looked at history, I looked historically at previous waves of automation, like when electricity was not widely introduced, for instance, and realized that what had always happened in the past was that a new technology comes along and a whole lot of jobs disappear in certain industries. But then new industries are created to make the new means of production. And then new services are associated with those new manufacturing industries. So lots and lots of new jobs are created, but then they don't affect the same workers, and they're not created in the same place necessarily as the old jobs that disappear. And that furthermore, these waves of innovation don't just happen like, you know, when you sort of learn science at school and you sort of find out, well, here's an invention, here's an innovation, and everybody thinks, oh, what a good idea, and then it spreads in this kind of even way. That actually capitalism doesn't work like that. There are lots of innovations that never get adopted, or don't get adopted at the time they're invented. Like, electric cars have been around for well over a century, but they don't necessarily suddenly doesn't get adopted as the dominant technology. The times when technology is adopted are when there's been a crisis, when there's been a kind of crisis in the capitalist system that means that lots of capitalist firms are no longer productive. So they have to find new ways, of reinventing themselves to become more profitable. And this happened in the 1970s. There was a huge crisis in 1973. There was the oil crisis, which triggered, in my opinion, in the aftermath of that crisis, the wave of adopting of new technologies that I was living through in the 70s. And exactly the same thing happened in the crisis of 2008, the last financial crisis. There was a big crisis for a lot of capitalist industries, which also, of course, was a crisis for working class people. And in the aftermath of that crisis, along came new firms with new business models using the technologies that have been, some of which have been hanging around for quite a long time, but they're starting to use them in new ways. And these new ways of using the technology take, I think, two very distinct forms. One is to cheapen the price of labor, to bring existing industries back to profitability by making labor much cheaper or much more efficient, which is how automation was used in the printing industry in the 1970s and in the auto industry. It tends to be the industries where workers are the best organized and the best paid that are targeted first, because that's where you make the biggest profits, by cheapening that labor. And we've similarly seen a wave of automation using robot technologies in factories and so on in the period following, in the last 10 years, in the period following the last financial crisis. But that's not enough in itself, although it doesn't just make profitability by automating the existing industries, but by making new kinds of means of production. It creates new jobs making those means of production. So you need factories that make the robots, you need factories that make the 3D printers, or the Google glasses, or whatever it is that's the new technology that's being used to automate other industries. But you also need completely new industries, and because capitalism really has to keep expanding in order to function. And where do those new activities come from, is my question. And the answer I came up with back in 1978, I think it was, I wrote the first article, well, the answer was a lot of it comes from the sphere of activity which is currently outside capitalism, things that we're all doing in our lives, which are sitting there, just quietly just getting on with them, can become new fields for making profit. And one of those fields is housework, it's domestic labor. And if you look historically back, for instance, when the technology of electricity first sort of got mainstream, so to speak, a lot of the new industries that grew up in the early 20th century were based on basically making new products that automated and made profitable aspects of housework. Things like washing machines and refrigerators and vacuum cleaners. and also entertainment, something that had gone on just, people, well, St. Patrick's Day is the perfect day to remember. There's a long tradition of people just entertaining each other. You went into a pub in Ireland and everybody sang, and people sang to their children, and there's huge musical culture, which kind of historically sat outside capitalism. But the technologies associated with electricity in the early 20th century brought them into capitalism, and we had radios and long playing records. Well, long playing ones were later, the 78 records, and so on, and all this sort of paraphernalia that goes along with the entertainment industry. But my point is that originally came out of an area of life that wasn't in capitalism, and the restructuring that came after the financial crisis that used the new technology brought it within the scope of capitalism. And so I wrote this paper back in 1978, sort of saying, well, I think this is what's going to happen now. I don't think capitalism is going to come to its knees. I think it's going to reinvent itself. And I think that the new commodities, some of the new commodities, will come out of our social lives, our private lives, and the labor that we do in the home for nothing. And they all went, oh God, feminists at it again. And my contribution to this book was rejected. And there was a rather short debate about in which people said, well, I think washing machines are a good thing. And then they went on to discussing, which was of course a serious issue, how new technology was going to de-skill coal miners. Which was seen as a very big issue at the time. And one didn't like to say, because feminists in the 70s, you didn't want to show any skepticism about your working class solidarity. So you didn't say, well, maybe coal mining is one of those jobs that should be automated out of existence. But because it's not a very nice job to do. Anyway, leave that aside. But the point is that paper, it was published in an obscure feminist paper called Scarlet Woman, and didn't see the light of day again for 25 years, when it appeared in a collection of essays that were published by Monthly Review Press in 2003. But I just wanted to say that this idea of that's when new commodities come from, has been sort of sitting there, was sitting there in my brain back in the 1970s, along with another idea which which I call a concept that I call consumption work, that was triggered by listening to now I think forgotten, very eccentric proto rap artist called Lord Buckley, who wrote a wonderful piece of work about supermarkets, about how when you push that trolley around the supermarket, you're working for them. This idea of unpaid labor being displaced onto consumers, that was previously paid labor carried out by service workers being displaced onto consumers. Anyway, I went on to do research on technology and labor, including being the first person in the UK to do research on teleworking, which is something, of course, we've all become very familiar with during the pandemic. In fact, I think somebody told me I coined the word. All I was doing was actually translating into English a word that some French scholars came up with, which was télétravail. But the idea that new technologies can made it possible to relocate work from the traditional workplace, where it was done in a kind of fairly controlled way during a fixed, like 9 to 5 or whatever working time, during the in a workplace that belonged to the employer, and therefore during working time that was regulated, that work could be actually, using these new technologies, be done at a distance. And if it can be done at a distance, then it managed remotely, then you can manage it by results instead of managing the workers by the time that they spend working, which made it possible to casualize it in various ways. But more importantly, if it can be done in somebody's home, then it can be done anywhere that technology is available. It needn't be home working. It could be done on the other side of the world as long as the right infrastructure is in place. So the research on teleworking led on to research on what came to be known in the 90s as offshore outsourcing, which evolved into work about how global value chains were being fragmented, well, held together by technology, but fragmented in terms of the workforce being very, very dispersed. So some work on global value chains, which of course then led into work on online platforms, which is my current field of research. But I think it's useful when thinking about the latest wave of technology and the development of online platforms. We can see them as a further evolution of the global division of labor, in which work managed, digitally managed work, can be dispersed spatially, managed centrally and spatially dispersed. But I think it's also useful to see how it also represents a new stage of capitalist development based on commodifying and marketizing work that was previously outside capitalism. And in order to do that, I think it's probably useful to look again at the household, which as a space is very, very much neglected in theorizing, both theorizing about communication media and theorizing about labor. And because I think if we think of the household as the kind of complicated and intricate space that it is, we can also understand how it's almost like kind of a laboratory for capitalism in terms of where it develops new commodities and new applications and where it grows. So that by looking inwards into the homes in which we live, it's also possible to look, so to speak, into capitalism and kind of like taking the back off the clock, to use an old-fashioned metaphor. Probably doesn't make sense to most of you. You take the back of the clock to see how it works. It seems to me that the household is a place where we can really understand what's going on in capitalism. Because the household I think perhaps now is the right moment to be doing this, because in the pandemic, we're all spending so much time locked down in our households, is that we can see it as the multi-dimensional space that it always has been, much more clearly than we have in the past. So what is it? I mean, there's a sort of conundrum in the sort of Marxist reading of the famous Marxist labor theory of value, which has got a kind of contradiction at the core of it, because the Marxist labor theory of value talks about the worker as if the worker goes out to the labor market, engages in this contest with capital for the value of his or her labor power as an individual, that you go out to work and you sell so much of your time for so much money. And that is the central sort of conflict which explains how capitalism works, according to Marx. But that worker who enters the labor market as an individual lives in a household and does a lot of his or her consumption as a member of the household and is reproduced in the household. So that does raise the question, when you're talking about the worker's cost of subsistence in an abstract way, whose subsistence are you actually talking about? Are you talking about one person's subsistence, or that person and their partner, or that person plus their partner plus their kids, or that person plus the partner plus the kids plus an elderly dependent that you're looking after in the household? It's a very kind of difficult kind of arithmetical sum to do, because it's all kind of knotted up together. The household is the place where labor power is reproduced in Marxist terms. It's where you raise children, but also where you acculture children, where they're taught to read and they're sung to and they're taught music and they're taught how to behave, given a lot of the skills and attributes and culture that they will then need as future workers to enter the labour market. It's also where existing workers are maintained. It's where we sleep, where we eat, where our clothes are laundered, and so on. It's where consumption happens, including any labour that's involved in that consumption, like, you know, going to the supermarket or spending hours on the phone talking to the call centre about the washing machine that doesn't work, or you know, a whole huge range of activity, assembling the IKEA furniture, but you know, lots and lots of consumption labour, as well as actual consumption going on. And it's the unit that pays rent for a whole lot of things, not just means of subsistence, like, you know, rental for keeping a roof over your head and keeping a water supply or an energy supply, but also increasingly the rent that's required to actually to be a worker, you know, like the broadband, the cost of broadband, for instance, or the Microsoft license, and, you know, all these other kind of tithes that we pay these days to global corporations to sort of keep the show on the road that is our domestic lives and our working lives. But the home is also a place of work, of direct work for the market, where historically that was often like craft type work or assembling things or knitting, you know, those kind of things. But increasingly these days it's like mainstream jobs that you're doing using the computer, teleworking from your home. But it's also a place of employment. It's a place where historically people employed domestic servants, more richer households employed domestic servants or farm labourers or so on. And many of us employ more casual kind of work, you know, like window cleaners and people who come and repair things, and cleaners, babysitters, and so on. So, so it's an enormously complex space with an awful lot of different activities going on, but also with internal power relationships as well, which might be just, you know, gender power being exercised in various ways, but might be also the power of an employer over a servant taking place within the home. And you actually, going back to Marx, you only have to look at Karl Marx's own household to see how complex these interrelationships were. You know, they had a servant who was sometimes paid and sometimes wasn't, with whom he fathered a child. You know, it was, in terms of power relations, it was an extraordinarily complex space. So anyway, so before I'm eventually going to quickly move to my current research, I think it's also worth reprising the feminist debates about the household, because right back to first wave feminism in the early 20th century or even earlier, it's been generally recognized by feminists that you cannot actually achieve gender equality without tackling what is sometimes called the problem of housework. Because while the domestic division of labour remains profoundly unequal, then not only are women disadvantaged relative to men within the home, because they're having to do an awful lot more of the domestic labour, unpaid domestic labour, but they're also disadvantaged outside the home, because the skills associated with domestic labour have no value, because everybody is supposed to know how to clean and how to cook and how to look after babies. So it means that in the external labour market, those become low-paid activities. It also means that the times that are available for women to enter the labour market are typically much more constrained than they are for men. You can only work, for instance, during school hours, or you know, certain times of the year or certain times of the day. And there's a whole bunch of ways that what happens inside the home in terms of domestic division of labour also shapes the external division of labour. And so it's almost a truism that until you can sort of crack the problem of housework, you're not going to crack the problem of equality in the external labour market. And there have been debates about how this can be achieved. And I think there are probably four main ways that we can say that women have feminists and when I say feminists, I include in this, of course, men who have also campaigned for feminist demands. That there have been four main solutions that have been perceived for this problem, and the first is to socialize it, to create public services that substitute paid labor for the unpaid labor that goes on in the home. Public laundries, public childcare, public health services, etc. And there was a huge wave in the mid-20th century of welfare states that did, certainly in Europe and parts of the developed world, including Canada, put in place some of these kind of services. And in some cases by creating brand new services, and in some cases by decommodifying existing services that were provided privately. In other words, by nationalizing like what had been private health services and so on. So that's been one important demand, but it's one increasingly over the last 50 years where we've all been on the back foot, and the energy has been going not into how do we create more, better, new public services, but how do we defend the ones that we've got from creeping closure and cuts and privatization and so on. So the second set of demands is to throw money at it. In the 1970s, the demand was for wages for housework, which there were fierce debates about it. These days, it's more demands for things like universal basic income. But there's the idea that if you give people money in recompense for doing domestic labour, it gives them more freedom of scope and more choices, economic choices, that make it easier, you know, to choose whether or not to pay someone else to do the work, or to go out and into the labour market and get paid work and so on. Some of these are problematic as well in various ways, but that remains an option. The third option is automated. You know, and they're going right back again to the early days of the 20th century. Some of you may have read H.G. Wells's Modern Utopia. There have been lots of ideas that of ways to automate housework and make it, you know, just basically automated out of existence. So you know, so you've got machines that are doing it. What little labour is involved, anybody can do, male or female. And unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, there have been an awful lot of technologies around, including a new wave using very sophisticated digital technologies where you can remotely control various devices in your home from your smartphone and so on. There are lots and lots of technologies to automate housework, but the evidence is firstly that a lot of them involve quite a lot of consumption labor. They create new kinds of, they get rid of one kind of labor and substitute another kind of consumption labor. But there's also rather little evidence that this, what the consumption labor that is involved, or the labor that's involved in like using the washing machine instead of using a laundry or whatever, that's necessarily going to be done equally by men and women. And it also, of course, makes it, because these automated products are commodities made for and supplied by capitalists, then they cost money, and so they're more, they're more readily available to rich people than poor people, and there are always going to be some people who can't afford them, which is another problem with that solution. But that's kind of around as a solution. And then the final solution is what you might call socialism in one household, just this idea that by an act of will, people can voluntarily change the division of labor. And there were in the 1970s lots of experiments in communal living that tried very hard to do this. And of course, we all know lots of households where men do voluntarily do a much larger than average share of the domestic labor. But unfortunately, there's rather little evidence that that this is happening on a sort of mass scale. And indeed, all the evidence coming out of research that's been done during the pandemic is that the more you put lock men and women together into their family homes, the more evident it becomes that women are doing the larger share of the homeschooling of the kids and the domestic labor generally. There was a very striking bit of research last year that was done by Nature magazine initially, and they looked at all the academic papers that had been submitted during the lockdown period by men and by women. And the number submitted by men had gone up, and the proportion submitted by women had gone right down, which I think tells you just about everything you need to know about the domestic division of labor in academic households, is that for male academics, not having to go into campus was a chance to get on with some writing. Overwhelmingly for women academics, being locked down at home meant trying to juggle the academic work with the childcare and the domestic labor, and meant that their writing productivity went right down. So anyway, there is some evidence that there's a narrowing of the gap between the number of days of housework done by men and the hours of housework done by men and by women. It's gone down, but it certainly hasn't. They certainly don't meet, even in Sweden, which is the most egalitarian country in the world. It's still women do like 1.6 hours of housework for every 1 hour that men do. But the main lesson to take from these statistics is it's not so much that men's hours of housework have gone up. They've gone up by a very, very small amount, but that women's hours of housework have gone down. And the reason women's hours of housework have gone down is that women are doing much more work, paid work, and there just aren't enough hours in the day for them to do as much housework as they did before. So what has actually happened has been an incredible time squeeze on households, which has become very, very dramatically evident in the period since the financial crisis. What happened? So what has happened since the financial crisis is that some trends that were already evident before the crisis have reached critical mass. and become visible in ways that they weren't before. We knew that austerity policies, going right back to the beginning, since the Thatcher-Reagan period in the late 1970s, when there started being a squeeze on public spending and an incentive to privatize public services. We know that the household services provided by the state have become scarcer and scarcer and scarcer at a time when the need for them has become greater and greater because of an aging population. There's much greater need for things like social care than there was 30 years ago. So that the need for social care has been going up, but the supply has not. So we've had these austerity policies. We've also had a fall in the value of the real wage, resulting, well, mainly from globalization, from the way that employers access a global supply of labor, as I mentioned earlier, talking about global supply chains. And they access this global reserve army, if you like, of labor in two distinct ways. And one is by offshoring, one is by getting production done in China instead of in Canada. And the other is by bringing, so to speak, bringing the workers to the jobs. It's by using migrant labor, which is typically much less well paid and much more precarious, by using migrant workers to do the low paid work. So the net effect of that around the world has been a lowering of the value of the wage of the, if you like, the type of worker who was the archetypal worker in the mid-20th century, the skilled male full-time manual worker who, for a privileged minority of households at least in the mid-20th century, earned what you could call a family wage. That family wage hardly exists now. Most households need both adults to be working in order to subsist. Most two-person households, I should say. So the wage has been coming down, the public services have been going down. Up until the financial crisis, in the first decade of the 21st century, when at the end of the month, the household found they couldn't make ends meet, the solution to that was to credit. People were encouraged to take out credit cards, stick it on a credit card. You can't afford to pay it, you'll pay for it eventually. And people were also encouraged to get into debt in relation to housing. And then after the financial crisis, that supply of credit was suddenly cut off. So we found this, households suddenly found themselves faced with this real time squeeze, just literally not enough money to make ends meet, and not enough time to do the household work. So you could say that the crisis that was a financial crisis there was a crisis for capitalism, was also a crisis for working class households, a crisis of social reproduction. And this is where my research comes in. And this is where I'm hoping I can, where are we? I can share a slide with you that's got some data on it. Now, where do we go? Share screen. Is that screen shared?
Yeah, we can see it, Ursula.
Right, there. Right. I'm sorry, I don't want to show you loads and loads of graphs, but this is a particularly interesting graph, which I think very graphically shows what I've been talking about. I've been doing, along with colleagues from the University of Hertfordshire, been doing a series of surveys across Europe from between 2016 and 2019 in 13 European countries, looking at the extent of people working for online platforms, which is a hard thing to define. And I could show you innumerable graphs like this, showing different kinds of aspects of the spread of platform labor in Europe. Now, what this slide shows is only platforms that provide household services, are narrowly defined. This doesn't even include the driving and delivery services. You could argue that platforms like Foodora or Deliveroo, or Uber Eats, that deliver food to your home, you could argue that that is a very clearly an example of commodifying household labor. People turning to the market to acquire a service that they don't have the time to do for themselves. You're exhausted after a day at work and you think, oh my God, I don't have time to go to the shops. I don't have time to cook. There's nothing in the freezer. Let's order a pizza, So you could argue that this is household labor being delivered by the market, by an online platform. This particular slide doesn't show that. I could show you other ones that do, which make the same point. But I decided for this one to focus only on paid labor that is actually carried out in your home, like people who come and do babysitting in your home, people who do cleaning, people who come and fix the boiler or put up shelves for you, or help you assemble your flat pack IKEA furniture. And this, the blue bars in this slide, if you can see it, show the percent of the proportion of the population in each country that actually work in supplying these services. And it's not all, because there are lots and lots of people occasionally work for online platforms, we discovered. These are people who do it at least once a week, work for an online platform, supplying services in people's homes. And a lot of whom, of course, do it on top of another job, but that's what the blue bars show. And what the orange bars show is the people who use these services. It's people who say, oh yes, in the last year, I have paid somebody to come and through a platform to come and clean my home or babysit or cut the hedge in the garden or clean the gutters or whatever it is. So as you can see, there's a high proportion of the population, between 30 and 40% in a lot of countries, who use online platforms for household services. There's also a significant proportion who work for these platforms. What the grey bars show, this is what's really interesting to me. What the grey bars show is the people who do both. Now, what you would expect, what a feminist of my generation would expect, looking at figures like this, you would think, oh yes, well, the more prosperous households, we use online platforms, we use, richer households deal with the social reproductive labor that they don't have time to do by paying someone else to do it. And we would see this in a sort of mistress-servant model, if you like. A lot of the research put it. And there's certainly a lot of evidence that one of the things that happened towards the end of the 20th century was a trend whereby middle-class educated women were able to enter the workforce on the same sort of basis as men by paying someone else, very often a migrant worker, to do their housework for them, to babysit their kids, to scrub the floor, to wait in on the day that the builders were coming, or whatever. That you have, so to speak, a privileged class of bourgeois women who are able to be almost equal to men in the labour market, but that's done on the backs of an exploited class of cleaning workers and childcare workers, and workers perhaps like those catering workers at Simon Fraser that are the subject of your dispute right now, a precarious group of workers whose role is to prop up the lives of the more privileged. So that is what we're kind of expecting to see. We're looking at these statistics, but what we saw instead, I'm not saying that doesn't go on, that if you look in detail at those people in the orange bars who are buying, using platforms to buy domestic services, it's more common. It's more common among people who earn a lot, but it's not that much more common. It's also very highly significant in the lowest category of earners, people who earn less than it's £20,000 a year in our UK terms, which is our lowest category. So, and if you look at the people in the blue bars, over 85% of them in most countries, in some countries over 90% of them, are also using the online platforms. Now, the figures are different because we did these surveys in different countries at different times, as you can see by the dates. So we're not exactly comparing like with like, but there's one country, the UK. We did our first survey in 2016, and then we then did another one in 2019. And what this shows is the speed with which the use of these online platforms has shot up in that 3-year period, the period immediately before the pandemic, from 2016 to 2019. And this partly explains the differences among the other countries, because the surveys were done at different times in the other countries. Between February 2016 and March 2019, the supply of these kind of domestic services, the people working for the online platforms that work in other people's homes, doubled in just a 3-year period. The people using the platforms went up from nearly a quarter, 23.8% of the population, to over 3 out of 10. It also significantly went up on the demand side. And if you look at some other platforms, they went up even more dramatically. The ride-hail services and food delivery services and so on went up even more dramatically. And again, you see the same picture of the people who work for ride-hail platforms will also use them, in their private capacities. But I wanted to show you this slide just to show how dramatic that growth was. And of course, since the pandemic, it's gone up a whole lot more. Some kinds of platforms like Airbnb and platforms like that, which are linked to tourism, have obviously will have gone down during the pandemic. But our use of things like food delivery services has dramatically increased during the pandemic, showing that this phenomenon has still got a long way to go. So what does it tell us about what's going on in households right now? It seems to me that we have a pattern whereby it's what I call the vicious cycle of platform work. But this is very dynamic. This is a spiral that is accelerating. You've got people who desperately need extra income, and that, of course, the pandemic has increased because so many people have been laid off during the pandemic, and a lot of the high street businesses that have closed during the pandemic are never going to open again, at least in the UK. So we're going to see a lot more of people very, very desperate for any income they can get. So what do people do? They can't find another full-time job. They work extra hours. They enroll onto online platforms because that's the easiest way of getting a few hours work here and a few hours work there. What we found is people tend to be enrolled on multiple platforms, and the number of platforms they enroll on is going up, it's not going down. They, as the supply of labour goes, as more and more people register as Uber drivers, that means there's less work for an Uber driver. So the Uber driver also registers on several other platforms and starts delivering food as well as delivering people and so on. So people are working longer hours. That means there's less time available for housework. And that I should probably at this point should remind you that having less time available for housework, having a time squeeze in the household, isn't just a sort of arithmetical problem of what time is available for what. It's also the cause of it makes the household really horrible. It means people are arguing about who does what. It means the kids are neglected and not getting enough attention. It means that people's mental health problems are exacerbated in various ways. It actually creates angry and upset, feuding households. It exacerbates whatever power difficulty, imbalances there are. And it is probably a direct contributor to this enormous rise we've seen, at least in the UK, during the pandemic, in cases of domestic abuse have absolutely shot up during the pandemic. And it's contributing to creating quite toxic relationships. It's not just meaning that there's no time to do the laundry. It's worse than that. And so what people are doing to deal with this impossible time squeeze, where you just can't possibly do all the things that are required of you, is they turn to the market. They buy household services in the market. And some of that, not all of that, takes the form of going to online platforms. Sometimes it's buying ready meals, instead of going to the market and buying lots of nice, healthy, cheap vegetables. It's you buy the ready meal from the corner shop because it's quicker and easier. But a lot of it is buying from platforms. And so then we get this enormous growth of platforms, which also spreads more low-paid precarious work, which puts more and more people into this situation of needing extra income. And so the wheel goes round and round and round. And so that we have to see the growth of online platforms as part of a new phase in the development of capitalism, struggling as it is to reinvent itself since the financial crisis. It's reinventing itself partly on the basis of domestic labour, and not just domestic labour, of course, other aspects of our private lives. You look at the way social media, for instance, are commodifying. And again, this has grown enormously during the pandemic. People sort of increasingly conduct their friendships via social media. They use digital media, as the main vehicle, not just for their work, even manual workers now. What you may be renting out, maybe your physical muscle or your dexterity, your manual dexterity, but you can't access that labour market without a smartphone and an app increasingly, or a laptop. So the digital media and digital corporations are mediating our social lives, mediating our labour market participation, and mediating our consumption. But increasingly using the resource that's being drawn on to create these new commodities is our personal lives and our domestic labour and our, if you like, household relationships are what's fueling it. And I think I probably should stop now. I think I'm over my time. I'll just show you one more slide, which is because this is the question of the start. This is the starting point for my new book. Was this question of how do we break that vicious cycle? And it seems to me that we need, I'm just going to summarize here, we need a complete reform of the tax benefit system to give people a kind of basic income that is both universal and redistributive, that we need new kinds of labour rights, a reform of labour law, that we need, but also, and this is, I think, probably the most contentious thing that I argue in my book, is that these digital technologies don't necessarily have to be just used to enrich companies in California that don't pay any tax back here in London or wherever it is that you happen to live, but could be actually be used for public good. I mean, in the 20th century, the welfare states that I grew up in the mid 20th century were very bold. They said these things should be nationalized. They nationalized electricity, they nationalized water supply, they nationalized in the UK the health service, things like distribution of milk was nationalized, road haulage industry was nationalized, the docks were nationalized. That there could, what we maybe need to look at what's around in the infrastructure of the 21st century that ought to be nationalized, like broadband, for instance, or social media platforms, or things, you know, if they are so necessary to our everyday life that they constitute part of our infrastructure, then shouldn't they be under public ownership and public control? And couldn't the online platforms that we use, you know, like to deliver pizzas and hamburgers to people who are too tired and exhausted to cook, couldn't they be used to deliver healthy meals to the elderly and the housebound? Couldn't the ride-hail services that, you know, take us, you know, people use for private journeys, couldn't they be used to take people to hospital appointments? Couldn't we use a platform model to take kids to school? Couldn't we use online platforms to distribute healthy food locally and enable people to feed into the food supply chain and enable hospitals and universities and schools to buy food locally from local suppliers and so on? Couldn't there be lots and lots of positive uses of these new technologies? So I've not even going to bother to read out that last bit. This is the vision that for a new kind of welfare state that is in my new book, that is summarized in that last lot of bullet points. So I think I'll stop there and wait for your questions. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ursula.
Have I stopped sharing? Yeah.
You stopped sharing your screen. Thank you so much for that outstanding talk, which took us all the way from the critical role that the household has played in political economy and deserves to continue to play, as well as the cutting edge engine that it continues to be with regard to capitalist subsumption and accumulation. It's 8:30 here on the West Coast. I'd say it's probably fair to give us about a half an hour. And so I think we can open the floor up to questions right now. I would prefer it if you could use the raise hand function to ask a question, and then I will be able to call on you in groups of 3. So who has questions? Wants to start us out? Questions for Ursula? Looking for digital hands raised. Yes, Ben, chat is okay for those of you who are timid. All right. So Ben Anderson from the School of Communication here at SFU says, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your work with us. A big proportion of the audience tonight is made up of undergraduates, and I know that at least a few of them are platform workers themselves. Would you be willing to briefly address what actions workers have begun taking to fight for their interests, with an eye to how these folks might be able to emulate these efforts. Okay, so that is one question. We said we were going to take them in groups of 3, if they do arrive in groups of 3.
Would you like me to come back on that one while the other people?
Sure. Yeah, that would be excellent, Ursula, if you want to take that question to begin with. And
yes, well, I've been very working very closely actually with some platform workers here in the UK who won a rather historic victory a couple of weeks, 2 historic victories actually. The app drivers and couriers union, who represent drivers for platforms like Uber and Bolt and Ola, and there are various driving platforms, Uber being the most famous one. And they took Uber to court back in 2016 when I first met them. Two guys got together and brought a court case against Uber to establish their rights to be treated as workers. We have in the UK, there's the status of an employee and there's a status of self-employed, but there's also a more generic status of worker, which we owe actually to having been members of the EU, because there are a lot of European directives that apply to all workers, which is defined in a different way from employee. Anyway, as workers, they would be entitled to the minimum wage, and they would be entitled to a few things like paid public holidays and a few things like that. Not all the rights that most employees have, but certain rights. So they took a test case to Uber and won, and Uber then took it to appeal and back to another appeal and all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court judgment was about a month ago, I mean, very recent, which they finally won and so they have won in principle the right to be treated as workers, which was huge. And in the meanwhile, they got together with a lot of other similarly placed workers. They organized an international federation. There's an international federation of they call them app drivers. Together with some other workers in Spain, was it Spain or Portugal? Not sure. Spain or Portugal. Anyway, who were working for Ola. They took both Uber and Ola have their European headquarters in Amsterdam for tax reasons, I think, as much as anything. So they brought a court case in Amsterdam against Uber and Ola, asking for the right to see the algorithms, because they felt that the way the algorithm is designed actually affects their right to earn an income. It's not at all transparent. They however much people get together and try and game the system and try and work out, what maximize your chances of getting this kind of a job in this kind of part of town as against that kind of job. And there's been a huge amount of work done among Deliveroo riders and so on this as well, actually, in Berlin particularly, but elsewhere. But they took to court, and 2 days ago they won that case too. They have won the right under European data protection law to actually see the algorithm, which is a huge victory for workers. It's a kind of digital right that is really important. So workers have been organizing. They've been doing a whole lot of things. They've joined the union. They give support to people who are being hustled by the licensing authorities. In London, for instance, you need a license to operate from Transport for London. And traditionally, the black cabs, the London black cabs, have been treated differently from other kinds of taxi drivers, and they've been hassled. Anyway, lots of detail I won't go into. But I think the bigger point I want to make is that the workers who have successfully organized have overwhelmingly been those who work for delivery platforms and driving platforms. In other words, workers who are out there on the street, often wearing identifiable uniforms or carrying bags with the logos of the companies they work for, who can identify each other on the street, and they hang out on the street and they meet each other in the same way that the dockers who organized in the 1880s hung out on the docks together waiting to be picked for that day's work and got to know each other. And so they were able to build solidarity, so to speak, in real time and real space. And right across Europe, you look at how delivery riders have organized in Italy, how how drivers have organized in Barcelona, whatever. This contact has been a very important aspect of the organizing and the various different kinds of actions that they've organized to resist the employers. Now, what's very striking about these people who work in other people's homes is how hidden a workforce they are. And this is why I'm focusing on them particularly now in my research, because they're very under-researched. It's very easy to go and work for Foodora or Deliveroo and do a PhD based on participant observation, hang out with the workers and call it a workers' inquiry, and get lots of interesting things. And they're very, very well researched, these groups. In the same way, in the 1970s, when I came on the scene, young people who wanted to do kind of research labor, they would go and work for auto companies, because that's what you did. It was easy in the 1970s for a fit young guy to get a job in an auto factory, and so hence a huge literature on how auto workers organize and resist during the 1970s. But it's much harder for domestic workers to organize. They're working secretly, they're working in people's homes, they're isolated from each other. And so going back even further in history, going back to those dockers in the 1880s, yes, the 1880s saw a huge wave of general unionization. It wasn't just the dockers who organized. It was famous, there was the Match Girls strike, factory workers started organizing. Karl Marx's daughter was very actively involved in a lot of these campaigns. But if you look at the statistics, for every factory worker in the 1880s, there were 5 domestic servants, and those domestic servants did not organize. And it's for precisely the same reasons, I would argue, that we're seeing now, we're seeing Uber drivers organizing and Deliveroo riders organizing, but we're not seeing people who work for these cleaning platforms organizing it at all in the same way. It's a much more hidden workforce. If you look around the world where domestic workers have organized, and they have, and they're organized right now in California, actually, very active domestic workers organization campaigns are going on. They organize in South Africa during the apartheid years. They organize in the Philippines. It's nearly always where it's linked to a broader political campaign, either based in particular ethnic groups among migrant workers, or some kind of national struggle, like the apartheid movement in South Africa. So, and that's, to me, points to the need for broader political organizing. I don't think it's enough to take a syndicalist approach to where you've got casual workers. It's not enough to just say, oh, well, they can organize, they can join a union, and then it can be like other unions. Collective bargaining will solve all their problems. Collective bargaining may solve some problems, but there are other problems that need a broader political platform of universal demands in order to solve them. Sorry, that was a very long answer. I hope by now you've got some more questions.
We do have another question, although I will say a quick hello actually to Carol Kurgan and Keeley, who are Dallas Smythe's daughter and granddaughter, who they are often able to join us when we do this in person. And I didn't know whether they were going to be able to make it this evening, but Carol just posted something in the chat. So welcome, Carol, and I'm really, really happy that you've been able to make it tonight. We have another question from in the chat. I've seen a lot of local ads for nannies through the pandemic. I'd be interested if you've seen any demographic changes come up already in domestic work during the pandemic and the health costs related. So I wonder, I guess this is a question around changes in domestic work during the pandemic, whether you've observed any.
Do you want me to come back now on that or wait for some more questions?
I think that you could maybe answer that question.
Yeah,
right
well,
now.
the short answer to that question is there's very, very poor statistics on this. I saw a survey that showed that people using a broader definition of household services, that it's been going up, but it's going up. It's not going down. It's going up. If you look at cleaning services, between 2001 and 2011, the number of people in the UK employing a cleaner went up from 5 million to 6 million. And interestingly enough, the rise was greatest among the young. People under 30 were much, much more likely to be employing a cleaner, which is not at all what I would expect. I never employed a cleaner when I was 30, but I think that might reflect people living in communal households. It might affect the housing shortage, and lots of people crammed together in small apartments and just not being able to deal with the personal politics about fighting about who does the cleaning. So it's easier to employ a cleaner. But in terms of childcare, certainly it's going up. But there are very poor, or at least I don't have access to good statistics about it. But I think it reflects, in the pandemic, it obviously reflects the closure of public nurseries. So I think you probably need to take a longer time frame to see if this is a long-term trend or a temporary trend. There's obviously people who are desperate to keep their full-time job and working from home, but who when the children's nursery is closed, so they can't send the kids to nursery, will be employing private nannies. There's also been a huge growth in platforms that substitute for home teaching, like home tutoring platforms, where you kind of remotely entertain someone else's child while they're working. It's one of the largest growing fields of platform labor there is. Again, it's a little bit difficult to tell how temporary this is, but I think these kind of remote services are a very interesting area to look at, because the other huge growth area is what people call the Uberization of psychotherapy, is mental health services that are delivered online, which a lot of psychotherapists are very worried about, because it's kind of, they see it as a huge de-skilling and casualization of the work that they do, which has traditionally been very intensive and professional and involves giving a lot of personal attention to people. There are now a lot of very sort of quick and dirty apps that purport to help with your mental health in various ways, but also ways of accessing therapy via platforms, which is probably doesn't have very good quality assurance attached to it. And I think this quality assurance issue is a huge issue with childcare as well. It's not just a question of, keeping your child occupied for 2 hours while you do that important Zoom call. It's what's happening during that 2 hours. I mean, how is it different from just using the screen to educate them? I think there are big quality issues as well as quantity issues. But with childcare also, of course, there are very different national patterns, because there are some countries, indeed some parts of Canada, like in Quebec, for instance, it's much more of a public service, if I understand it rightly, than it is in in BC, there are big differences in how these services are delivered. It can be delivered through unpaid labor, obviously in the traditional way. It can be delivered through publicly paid workers, or it can be delivered through privately paid workers. And again, there's a difference between, are those privately paid workers individually employed by you, or are they employed by a capitalist childcare company? And it seems to me that the general trend is overwhelmingly for services to be delivered by capitalist companies. That the public sector is being squeezed. A private childcare that's supplied purely through unpaid labor for its use value is being squeezed because of the pressure to earn money, because of the time pressure. And privately employed workers are being driven to the online platforms because the traditional ways of finding them have gone. You know, people used to find domestic workers through word of mouth, through leaflets delivered through letterboxes, through ads in the local library or the newsagent's window or whatever. And now everything's done through Google. People search through Google, and what you find through Google is platforms, because they know how to tweak the ratings. You know, the power of you know, if you've got the resources to enter every single postcode in the country, and to every kind of occupation that somebody might be looking for in the home, if I put in my postcode and say plumber, I'm not going to find the local plumber I would have found 40 years ago in the local yellow pages. I'm going to find an online platform that presents as a local plumber. And so people who used to be independent plumbers are being driven to work for the online platforms because they can no longer find customers the traditional way. So the overwhelming pressure is for a larger and larger and larger proportion of the working class to be working either all the time or part of the time for these platforms, which of course are, you know, taking, not just exploiting the workforce, but also taking a huge chunk of money out of local economies, because the model is to take a percentage of the value of each transaction. It can be 20 or 25% in many platforms of the value of the transaction is being hoovered out of the local economy and accumulated somewhere else. So that money isn't circulating in the local economy the way it would have 40 years ago. It's being taken out, and it's building more and more polarization around the world between kind of rich cities and poor cities, you might say.
I don't see any other questions, but I've got a question to ask you, Ursula. I wondered if you could comment on a division that has always been there between different portions of the workforce, and in fact, different portions of the workforce which you've done research around, which has become which has been exacerbated by the pandemic, and that is between the more privileged workers who are able to work online from home and those who need to leave their home in order to work. And I wonder whether you could speak to the implications of that, and whether they are short-term or whether they're more longer-term in your view.
That's a very interesting question, Enda. Thanks for that. It's I wrote an article back in, I think, 2006, a monthly review about what I called fixed workers and footloose workers. And the fixed workers are, as you said, Enda, people who tend to work from one place and communicate with the world increasingly via digital technologies. And the footloose workers are the people who have no choice but to be out there working in real time, in real space, interacting with people. And during the pandemic, there's been a huge fracturing, if you like, of the workforce between the people who are locked down in their homes and the people who are out there on the streets risking their lives very often to bring them the physical goods and services that they need in real time and real space, either by bringing goods to the home, whether that's, you know, delivering the shopping that's been ordered online, or bringing the ready meals, or doing the basic services like collecting waste or so on, or tending to the other aspects of the physical needs, the things that can't be locked down, whether that's working in food processing factories, for instance, where, as we all know, there have been a lot of outbreaks of the virus in food processing plants, or working in services like hospitals and schools, tending to the bodily needs of people who for some reason or other can't be in their homes. And there's very striking demographic differences. The footloose workers are much more likely, at least here in the UK, to be from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, to be precarious, to be low paid, to be insecure in various ways, and not have such good social protection. And the fixed workers are much more likely to have not so much to be highly educated as they are, but to have their qualifications recognised and rewarded, and to be in permanent jobs with, you know, with pension provision and some kind of job security and so on. But having said that, they also, these two groups have historically, I think for the first time, got more in common than they ever had before. And what they have in common is, firstly, they're much, much more likely to be working for a very large global corporation than they were before, because there's been this huge concentration of capital. The market share of global corporations has massively gone up. It's been going up for decades, but during the pandemic, it's just shot up. As the businesses that have been suffered have been the small and medium-sized businesses that have had to close down. All those high street shops and restaurants and hairdressers and, you know, franchises and so on. They've been the losers, and companies like Amazon have been the winners in shopping massively. And that the same has also been happening in other sectors, in the shakeout after the financial crisis. It was the smaller manufacturing companies that went out of business, and the bigger manufacturing companies that were able to completely retool and develop new business models. So more, whether it's directly or indirectly, more and more of us now work for very, very large corporations, and fewer of us work for small businesses. But secondly, we're all increasingly surveyed by these digital technologies. If you're a footloose worker, then it's likely you're being very precisely tracked in real time using GPS data. You know, they know exactly where you are at any given time, what you're delivering, and there's feedback from the customer about, you know, when the delivery arrived and when it was ordered and how long you've spent in that particular place. And so that the footloose workers are being massively digitally managed, and also the quality of their work managed through user ratings and things of that sort. But meanwhile, all of these home workers are also being digitally surveyed and managed, not just by, you know, whatever you do via a digital interface is automatically tracked. It's leaving a data trail. You know, how long it took you to do this job, how many times you've interacted with people, how long you spent on that particular Zoom meeting or whatever, but also surveyed in other more invidious ways. For instance, there's been a huge spike in sales of like these software packages that actually watch you. You know, they take a picture through your webcam every 5 minutes, night and day. Very often, whoever's using the computer, whether it's your kids doing their schoolwork or your partner doing the shopping or you doing it in your Zoom meeting, it's all being captured. and there are these very, very sophisticated algorithms that you see being used, for instance, in call centers. They're now algorithms that automatically, they don't just monitor the duration of the call, they analyze what they think is going on emotionally. They use speech recognition software. And then the call center operator has these pop-up emojis that tell them when they think the customer is getting stressed or getting angry or feeling pleased or whatever. And these are all, the actual emotional content of what's going on is being monitored and analysed and used to measure the workers' performance and give them ever more sophisticated targets. And this is why the victory in Amsterdam of these Uber drivers to have the right to see the algorithm has huge implications. It has implications not just for other platform workers. It has implications for not all workers, but for the vast majority of workers, for those of us whose daily working life is mediated via digital technologies. So this seems to me a very, very important precedent. When we're talking about new universal rights for workers, I don't just mean the kind of rights that were won in the 20th century and have since been eroded, you know, the rights to be represented by a trade union and to have a permanent job and, you know, to be given due notice before of changes and have a pension and have maternity leave and paternity leave and so on. Not just those kind of rights, but the right to be able to challenge an unfair user rating, the right to know what happens to the data that is collected on you at work, the right to see the algorithm that is being used to determine the next bit of work you get given, and so on. We really need a new universal set of rights, and these digital rights seem to me to be an integral part of that set.
Thank you, Ursula. The kinds of rights that could unite an Amazon Mechanical Turk worker who has to work from home and an Amazon fulfillment center worker who has to work in a factory, right? Divided but brought together, perhaps.
And the rights of an academic who does research on it too. Let's not forget, academic workers are subjected to a lot of these things. We get the user ratings from students. We have the performance targets. We are digitally managed along with all the rest of them.
Yeah, increasingly, it's true. Thank you so much, Ursula. I am so thankful that you woke up in the middle of the night in order to deliver the Dallas Smythe Memorial Lecture. I really appreciate it. I think everyone that came benefited immensely from it. I would also like to thank the folks who showed up and of course everyone that helped to organize this evening. Thank you, and we hope to actually physically have you in Vancouver at some point soon.
Well, apologies again for keeping you waiting. I'm so embarrassed by that, but thank you very much for your time.
I think it's entirely understandable under the circumstances. Thank you, Ursula, and thank you everyone else.
Thank you.